Matthew 7, verse 12 to 14. As the Sermon on the Mount draws toward its conclusion, these words summarize the character of the kingdom proclamation and the decisive moment that stood before the generation hearing Jesus speak. Verse 12 declares, "Therefore all things whatsoever you would that men should do to you, do you even so to them. For this is the law and the prophets." The statement begins with "therefore," linking it to the preceding teaching about the Father's goodness in giving good gifts to those who ask. Because the Father is generous, merciful, and gracious, the life of those who belong to his kingdom reflects that same character toward others. The principle expressed here is often called the Golden Rule, yet Jesus presents it not as a new ethical invention, but as the very essence of the Scriptures. He says it is the law and the prophets. The law and the prophets formed the entirety of Israel's sacred writings. Throughout those writings, God revealed the nature of covenant life. Love for neighbor summarized the relational expectations of the covenant. Jesus condenses the moral heart of that revelation into a single sentence. Instead of merely avoiding harm, the command is proactive: treat others according to the same goodwill one desires for oneself. In doing so, the true intention of the Scriptures is fulfilled. This declaration stands within the larger theme of fulfillment that runs throughout Matthew's Gospel. The law and the prophets pointed forward to a climactic moment when their meaning would reach completion. In the presence of Jesus and the kingdom, he announced that moment was arriving. The righteousness envisioned in the Scriptures would be realized not through human striving, but through the work that God himself was bringing to completion through his Son. Following this summary of the Scriptures, Jesus presents a contrast that reflects the urgency of that historical moment. "Enter ye in at the strait gate, for wide is the gate, and broad is the way, that leadeth to destruction, and many there be which go in thereat." The imagery shifts to two gates and two roads. One is wide and spacious, accommodating the crowds. The other is narrow and difficult, entered by relatively few. The contrast describes two responses to the kingdom proclamation that was going forth in Israel during the ministry of Jesus. The broad way represented the prevailing course of the nation. Many continued along the familiar path shaped by religious tradition, national expectation, and confidence in the existing covenant order centered in Jerusalem and the temple. That path appeared secure because it aligned with the majority and preserved the structures that had defined Israel's life for centuries. Yet Jesus declares that this broad road leads to destruction. The term points to the coming judgment that would soon confront that covenant world. The generation hearing these words stood on the brink of a decisive transition in redemptive history. The old order, with its temple-centered system and national identity under the law, was approaching its end. Continuing along that path meant remaining within a system destined for judgment. In contrast, Jesus calls his hearers to enter through the narrow gate. Because strait is the gate, and narrow is the way, which leadeth unto life, and few there be that find it. The narrow gate signifies the acceptance of Jesus and the kingdom he proclaimed. This path was difficult, not because it demanded human achievement, but because it required turning away from the familiar structures in which Israel had placed its confidence. To follow Jesus meant recognizing that the fulfillment of the Scriptures was not found in the preservation of the Old Covenant order, but in the person and work of the Messiah. Life, in this context, refers to the covenant life of the age that God was inaugurating through Christ. It is the life promised throughout the Scriptures, the life of the kingdom, the life that flows from God's gracious initiative rather than from human performance. Entrance into that life came through faith in the one who stood before them announcing the arrival of God's reign. The reason few found this path was not because the promise was restricted, but because many struggled to relinquish the framework through which they had long understood their relationship with God. The message that righteousness and life would come through the Messiah rather than through adherence to the existing covenant structures was difficult for many to receive. Thus, the contrast between the two gates reflects the larger transition unfolding in the first century. One way represented attachment to the covenant order that was passing away. The other represented entrance into the new reality being established through Jesus. One culminated in judgment upon that old system, while the other opened into the enduring life of the kingdom. In these verses, Jesus brings together the themes that have woven throughout the Sermon on the Mount. The scriptures find their true meaning in him. The Father's goodness stands behind the kingdom invitation, and the generation hearing his words faced a defining choice between two paths, one broad and familiar, the other narrow yet leading into the life God was establishing through his Son.